They didn't fire me. That would have been too honest. Instead, they leaned across the table and said, "Resign quietly, or we'll have to review your record." 21 years of loyalty reduced to a threat wrapped in a smile. I went home, typed one calm sentence, and walked away without arguing. No drama. No accusations. They thought that email ended everything. 5 days later, their lawyer called. Then another. And another. Because that one sentence I wrote. It didn't protect them. It exposed them. When I started at that company, it was barely more than an idea and a rented office with mismatched chairs. No fancy titles, no polished leadership, just a handful of people trying to survive. I was young, eager, and proud to have a job that felt like it mattered. I stayed late without being asked. I learned systems no one wanted to touch. I became the person people called when things quietly went wrong. Over the years, I trained managers who would eventually outrank me. I fixed mistakes that never had my name attached to them. When deadlines were missed, I stayed. When clients were angry, I smoothed it over. When departments fell apart, I was the one asked to help for a while, which somehow turned into forever. My work lived in the background, invisible, until the moment it was needed. I watched people come and go. Fresh hires. New executives. Consultants who spoke in buzzwords and left with bonuses. Each time leadership changed, I was reassured I was valuable, essential, part of the backbone. Raises were slow. Promotions were promised and postponed. Recognition came in the form of more responsibility, never more authority. For 21 years, I showed up early and left late. I knew the policies better than HR and the systems better than IT. I carried institutional memory no document ever captured. And the truth is, I believed loyalty still meant something. I believed that being dependable would protect me. What I didn't realize was that while I was holding everything together, they were slowly forgetting I existed, until the day they decided I was inconvenient. Everything shifted the year the new leadership arrived. New faces, new titles, and a lot of confident smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They talked about growth, efficiency, and modern thinking, like the past 2 decades had been some embarrassing phase they needed to outgrow. Suddenly, experience wasn't respected anymore. It was questioned. Meetings changed first. Conversations that used to include me started happening behind closed doors. Decisions were announced instead of discussed. When I asked reasonable questions, I was told not to worry, that things were being handled. The tone was polite, but the message was clear: stay in your lane. They brought in consultants next. People half my age with slide decks and rehearsed confidence. They asked me how things worked, took notes, nodded, and then presented my answers as their own ideas in leadership meetings. I sat quietly in the back, watching people get praised for explaining systems I had built years earlier. Then came the subtle language. I was described as legacy. Old structure. Deeply rooted. None of it sounded like a compliment. The new executives didn't see stability, they saw resistance. They didn't see loyalty, they saw cost. And I could feel the shift in how they looked at me, like I belonged to a different version of the company they were trying to erase. I didn't panic. I told myself this was just another phase, another leadership cycle that would pass. I kept my head down, did my job, and stayed professional. I had survived restructures before. What I didn't know yet was that this time, I wasn't being overlooked. I was being studied, and quietly prepared for removal. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as process improvements and minor adjustments. A responsibility I'd handled for years was suddenly reassigned. A decision I used to approve now needed alignment. My calendar started thinning out, not because the work was gone, but because I was no longer invited into the rooms where it was discussed. Then came the documentation. Requests to summarize my role. Emails asking me to explain tasks I'd been doing successfully for decades. Performance check-ins that felt less like conversations and more like fishing expeditions. Nothing overt. Nothing I could point to and say, "This is wrong." Just enough to make me feel watched. People I once mentored began managing my output. Instructions came filtered through new layers of approval. If I pushed back, even politely, the atmosphere shifted. I was told I was being defensive. If I stayed quiet, I was labeled disengaged. There was no winning, only surviving. I noticed how mistakes were treated differently. When others slipped, it was framed as learning. When I did, even minor issues were documented, saved, and revisited. I realized they weren't managing me anymore. They were building a narrative. At home, I started keeping copies of everything. Emails. Reviews. Messages that contradicted each other. I didn't know why yet, only that something felt off. After 21 years, my instincts were sharp. The same instincts that had kept me employed through every previous storm were now telling me this one was aimed directly at me. The strangest part was the silence from leadership. No direct feedback. No clear expectations. Just distance. And distance, I learned, is how companies create exits without ever saying the word. By the time I was finally called into HR, the decision had already been made. The squeeze wasn't about improvement. It was about pressure, applied slowly enough that when I finally broke, they could claim it was my choice. The calendar invite arrived late in the afternoon, dropped into my inbox with no explanation. No agenda. No context. Just a 15-minute meeting labeled Quick Sync. I knew better than to believe that. After 21 years, you learn which meetings are conversations and which ones are verdicts. The next morning, I walked into the conference room exactly on time. 2 people were already there. One from HR. One I didn't recognize, sitting slightly too still, with a folder placed neatly in front of him. No laptops. No small talk. The door clicked shut behind me, and suddenly the room felt smaller. HR smiled the practiced smile, the kind meant to soften bad news without changing it. She thanked me for my time, for my service, for my years of contribution. Each compliment landed like a period at the end of a sentence. Then she said the line I had been expecting but still wasn't ready to hear, "This isn't a termination meeting." The man with the folder finally spoke. His voice was calm, rehearsed. He explained that the company was moving in a new direction, and that my role no longer aligned with future priorities. He emphasized choice. Options. Flexibility. Words designed to sound generous while closing every door. Then came the suggestion. Not an order. Not a demand. A suggestion. That I consider resigning. Quietly. Professionally. In a way that would be best for everyone involved. They framed it as dignity. As control. As if walking away from 21 years could be wrapped in a bow. I listened without interrupting. I didn't argue. I didn't react. Inside, something shifted. Because I understood what this meeting really was. It wasn't about alignment or change. It was about getting me to leave without them having to push. Once the word resign was on the table, the tone changed. The smiles faded. The politeness sharpened into something colder. HR leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice like she was sharing advice instead of delivering a warning. She said resignation would protect my reputation and allow everyone to move on smoothly. That's when I knew the meeting was no longer optional in any real sense. The man with the folder opened it. Inside were printed emails, performance notes, and vague references to concerns that had never once been raised with me before. He didn't accuse me outright. He didn't have to. He simply explained that if I chose not to resign, the company would be forced to conduct a formal review of my record. The pause after that sentence was deliberate. They let the silence work on me. They wanted me imagining worst-case scenarios. Damaged references. Legal complications. A 21-year career reduced to footnotes and question marks. HR framed it as kindness. She said this was about giving me a graceful exit. About avoiding unnecessary complications. What she really meant was pressure, applied just softly enough to deny later. I asked one question. I wanted to know what exactly in my record justified this sudden concern. The answer was a vague list of patterns, perceptions, and misalignments. Nothing concrete. Nothing provable. Just enough ambiguity to feel dangerous. That's when anger finally surfaced, quiet but steady. Not explosive. Focused. I realized they weren't threatening me because I had done something wrong. They were threatening me because they believed I would panic. Because after 21 years, they assumed fear would make me compliant. They offered time to think it over. 24 hours. A deadline disguised as courtesy. I nodded, thanked them for their transparency, and walked out of that room with my posture straight and my voice calm. Inside, I understood something clearly for the first time. This wasn't about my performance. It was about control. And control only works if the other person doesn't know their rights. That night, I didn't turn on the television. I didn't call anyone. I made a cup of coffee and opened my laptop like I was preparing for an exam I hadn't known was coming. The house was quiet, and for the first time since the meeting, I let myself slow down. I pulled up my employment contract first. The original one. Then every update, amendment, and policy change that had followed over the years. I read each line carefully, not emotionally. I wasn't looking for reassurance. I was looking for leverage. Next came my performance reviews. Year after year of exceeds expectations. Emails praising my reliability. Messages thanking me for stepping in during crises. I saved everything. I noticed how recently the language shifted, how feedback became vague only after new management arrived. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. Then I reread the emails from HR. The wording mattered. What they implied versus what they actually said. I read them twice, sometimes 3 times. The threats were never direct. They were carefully constructed to scare without committing anything to paper. That detail alone told me more than they realized. Around midnight, something clicked. The company wasn't confident. If they were, they wouldn't need pressure or intimidation. They wouldn't be pushing for resignation instead of termination. They were trying to avoid something: liability, scrutiny, consequences. I opened a blank document and started listing dates, names, and moments that suddenly made sense. Meetings where my authority was stripped. Emails that contradicted themselves. Tasks reassigned without explanation. Piece by piece, a picture formed that had nothing to do with poor performance. By the time the coffee went cold, I wasn't afraid anymore. I wasn't angry either. I was focused. Calm in the way you get when you realize the ground under your feet is firmer than you were led to believe. That's when I understood the truth. They weren't offering me an exit. They were asking me to give them protection. And I had no intention of doing that for free. The next morning, I didn't rush. I didn't rehearse arguments in my head or imagine confrontations. I sat at my desk, opened a new email, and stared at the blank screen longer than I stared at anything in years. This wasn't about emotion. This was about precision. I thought about every word they had used in that room. Resign. Protect your reputation. Review your record. Then I thought about what they had avoided saying. No accusations. No documented cause. No termination. That silence told me exactly how careful I needed to be. I wrote one sentence. Not dramatic. Not defensive. Just clear. Professional. Neutral in tone but deliberate in structure. I stated my decision to resign, effective immediately, and thanked them for the opportunities provided. No apologies. No admissions. No explanations. Then I read it again. And again. I removed anything that could be interpreted as agreement with their narrative. I avoided emotion like it was a liability, because in moments like this, it is. I made sure the sentence stood on its own, impossible to twist without effort. Before sending it, I saved a copy. Then another. I emailed it from my personal account and my work account, time-stamped and archived. I knew this message would be read more carefully than any performance review I'd ever received. When I finally clicked send, there was no relief. No sadness. Just clarity. The kind that settles in when you know you've made the cleanest move available. They thought the resignation ended the story. They believed the sentence closed the file. What they didn't understand yet was that words matter. And the way something is written can matter more than what is written. That single sentence didn't protect them. It protected me. After I sent the email, nothing happened. No reply. No acknowledgement. Not even an automated response. The silence was immediate and deliberate, like a door closing without a sound. I waited an hour, then another, not because I expected an answer, but because I wanted to observe how quickly I disappeared. By the end of the day, my access was gone. Email locked. Systems unreachable. Shared folders vanished like they had never existed. 21 years of work, erased with a few keystrokes. No farewell message. No goodbye call. Just digital absence. The next morning, I checked my phone out of habit. Still nothing. No HR follow-up. No instructions. No confirmation. It was as if they believed ignoring me would make everything final. That quiet felt intentional. Silence, I realized, was their way of declaring victory. I spent that day doing ordinary things. Laundry. Dishes. A walk around the block. The world didn't collapse. No alarms went off. And yet, beneath the calm, I sensed movement on the other side of the silence. Companies don't go quiet when they're confident. They go quiet when they're hoping time will do their work for them. Late that afternoon, I noticed something strange. A forwarded email from a colleague who hadn't realized my access was cut. It referenced a meeting about risk assessment. My name wasn't in the subject, but it was in the subtext. They were talking about me. That's when I understood. The silence wasn't peace. It was delay. They were buying time, assuming I would fade out quietly and accept the ending they had written for me. They thought the story was over. It wasn't. Because silence only works when both sides are afraid to speak. 5 days passed without a sound. Then, on a quiet afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Something told me to answer. The voice on the other end was calm, polished, and careful. He introduced himself as legal counsel for the company. Not HR. Not management. Legal. That alone told me everything had changed. He didn't accuse me. He didn't threaten me. He asked questions. Polite ones. Measured ones. He said they were reviewing my resignation and needed clarification. The word clarification was doing a lot of work. I asked what needed clarifying. There was a pause, just long enough to be intentional. Then he referenced the sentence. The one I had typed. He read it back to me slowly, as if the meaning might shift if he heard it out loud. He wanted to know what I intended by it. I told him my intention was exactly what the sentence said. Nothing more. Nothing less. He thanked me and tried a different angle. Asked about the meeting with HR. Asked whether I felt pressured. Asked whether anyone had suggested resignation rather than termination. That's when I realized this call wasn't about understanding. It was about containment. They weren't trying to learn my position. They were trying to assess their exposure. I answered carefully. Truthfully. I described the meeting as it happened. I used their words, not mine. I didn't editorialize. I didn't speculate. I let silence do its job when questions leaned too far. By the end of the call, his tone had shifted. Still polite, but no longer relaxed. He thanked me again and said someone would follow up. When the line went dead, I sat there for a moment, phone still in my hand. 5 days ago, they thought my resignation solved everything. Now their lawyer had my number, and he didn't sound relieved at all. The follow-up call came the next morning. Same number. Same lawyer. This time, there was no small talk. He went straight to the sentence again, reading it slowly, word by word, like he was testing each one for weakness. He asked me what I meant by choosing to resign under the circumstances discussed. He wanted to know why I included that phrase. Whether it reflected pressure. Whether it implied dissatisfaction. Whether it suggested coercion. Each question was carefully framed, designed to lead without accusing. I didn't rush to answer. Silence is uncomfortable on legal calls, and I let it stretch. Then I told him the truth. I said the sentence meant exactly what it said. That I made a decision after a conversation with HR. That I chose my wording carefully. That nothing in it was accidental. He adjusted his approach. Asked if I felt the company had given me an ultimatum. Asked whether I believed my resignation was voluntary. Asked if I had consulted counsel before sending the email. Each question circled the same point from a different direction. I realized something important in that moment. If my sentence truly protected them, this call wouldn't exist. If my resignation closed the door cleanly, they wouldn't be dissecting a single line of text like it was evidence in a trial. When I answered, I stayed neutral. I didn't accuse. I didn't defend. I simply described events as they happened and stopped talking when the facts were complete. I let him sit with them. At one point, he sighed. Not dramatically. Just enough to be human. He said he appreciated my professionalism. That phrase again. Professionalism always becomes important when consequences appear. Before ending the call, he said the company wanted to ensure mutual understanding. I told him understanding was already there. It just arrived later for some than others. When the call ended, I knew something had shifted. They weren't worried about what I might do. They were worried about what I already had. And all of it traced back to that one sentence they thought was harmless. That it took me a while to name what had happened, but once I did, everything fell into place. They didn't fire me. They pushed me. Carefully. Repeatedly. Just enough to make resignation feel like the safest option. What they thought was subtle pressure turned out to be a record of behavior. By asking me to resign instead of terminating me, they created a problem they didn't intend. Pressure changes things. Especially when it's documented. Especially when it comes after decades of positive performance and no prior discipline. They didn't just mismanage my exit. They defined it. Every reassigned responsibility, every closed-door meeting, every vague concern, without follow-up suddenly mattered. Those weren't isolated incidents anymore. Together, they formed a pattern. One that suggested the decision was made long before the meeting ever happened. The wording of my resignation mattered because it reflected context, not consent. I didn't say I was leaving happily. I didn't say I was leaving voluntarily in the way they wanted. I acknowledged the circumstances without endorsing them. That distinction was everything. What they accidentally triggered was scrutiny. Not noise. Not threats. Scrutiny. The kind that forces companies to explain timelines, decisions, and documentation they assumed no one would question. The kind that turns quiet exits into legal conversations. That's why the calls kept coming. Not because they wanted to negotiate yet, but because they needed to understand how exposed they were. What I knew. What I had saved. What I might do next. I didn't need to raise my voice or make demands. The facts spoke for themselves. 21 years of clean performance doesn't vanish overnight without explanation. Pressure doesn't disappear just because it wasn't labeled as such. They believed resignation protected them from consequence. Instead, it did the opposite. It opened a door they couldn't close quietly. One sentence became a mirror, reflecting everything they thought they'd buried. And once a company sees its reflection clearly, panic usually follows. After that, the calls changed. They didn't stop, but they softened. Voicemails instead of direct questions. Emails phrased carefully, asking for availability rather than answers. Each message sounded more polite than the last, and that politeness wasn't accidental. It was caution. One call came from a different number. Another lawyer. Same firm, different tone. He thanked me for my time before I even agreed to speak. Said the company wanted to resolve things amicably. That word again. Amicably. It's amazing how quickly language shifts when leverage moves. I noticed the pattern immediately. They weren't calling to clarify anymore. They were calling to measure. To see how firm I was. How calm. How informed. Every response I gave was short, factual, and deliberate. I never volunteered more than was asked. Some days, I didn't answer at all. Let the phone ring. Let the voicemail fill. Silence works differently when you're not the one afraid of it. Each unanswered call made the next one more urgent. Emails followed. Carefully worded messages referencing mutual benefit and moving forward constructively. No admissions. No apologies. Just enough warmth to disguise concern. They asked if I'd be open to discussion. If I'd consider a call with leadership present. I declined, politely. What struck me most was the shift in power. A week earlier, they had sat across from me with a folder and a threat. Now, they were asking for my time like it was something valuable. I kept records of every attempt to contact me. Dates. Times. Names. Not because I planned to use them, but because documentation had become a habit. And habits formed under pressure tend to be useful. By the end of that week, I hadn't made a single demand. I hadn't accused them of anything. I hadn't even raised the word legal. And yet, their lawyers kept calling. Because when a company realizes it made a mistake, it doesn't announce it. It reaches out quietly and hopes the other side doesn't press too hard. The conversation finally changed when the calls stopped asking if I was willing to talk and started asking when. That's how I knew they were ready. Not to argue. Not to explain. To close. The offer didn't come in dramatic language. It arrived quietly, wrapped in phrases like good faith and mutual resolution. No one admitted fault. No one ever does. But the urgency was unmistakable. Time, suddenly, mattered to them. They didn't put a number in the first message. They wanted to test my response. I replied with one sentence. I said I was open to resolving the matter professionally and expected the discussion to reflect the full scope of my tenure and circumstances. Nothing more. The next call was different. Slower. Careful. They talked about avoiding disruption. About protecting everyone involved. They mentioned confidentiality, non-disparagement, finality. The words companies use when they know the alternative is worse. I listened. Asked a few questions. Took notes. I didn't rush them. I didn't counter immediately. Silence, once again, did most of the work. They filled it with better terms. What they offered wasn't charity. It was insurance. A way to make sure what happened never became a lesson for others inside the company. The amount reflected that. Not extravagance. Not an apology. Just enough to make sure the story ended here. When everything was finalized, the tone shifted one last time. Relief. Professional courtesy. Gratitude for my cooperation. I signed nothing until every word was clear. Experience had taught me that clarity is expensive, and worth it. They got what they wanted. Silence. Closure. Control of the narrative. I got something else. I got confirmation. After 21 years, the moment I stopped protecting them, they moved fast to protect themselves. When it was over, there was no celebration. No victory speech. No moment where everything suddenly felt fair. There was just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in after something heavy has been carried for a long time and finally set down. For years, I believed loyalty would protect me. That showing up early, staying late, and fixing problems no one wanted to claim would earn safety. I thought being dependable made me untouchable. What I learned instead is that loyalty without leverage only works as long as it's convenient. The truth is, they didn't forget what I did for them. They counted on it. They assumed my history with the company would keep me compliant. That my professionalism would turn into silence. That fear would make me grateful for whatever ending they offered. They were wrong. Not because I fought loudly. Not because I threatened or exposed anyone. But because I paid attention. I documented. I chose my words carefully. I understood that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in emails, timelines, and the quiet confidence of knowing what you're entitled to. What surprised me most wasn't how fast they changed when lawyers got involved. It was how quickly respect appeared once risk did. The same people who dismissed me as legacy suddenly valued my perspective when consequences entered the room. If there's a lesson in all this, it's a simple one. Experience is only dangerous when it's aware of itself. And companies that push people out quietly often forget one thing: they don't control what someone knows once they leave. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't seek revenge. I just stopped carrying weight that wasn't mine to hold anymore. And the moment I did, everything shifted. So if you ever find yourself being pressured instead of respected, rushed instead of valued, remember this. Calm isn't weakness. Silence isn't surrender. And one carefully written sentence can change the entire balance of power. They thought making me resign would end the story. It didn't. It just made them realize, far too late, that they should have treated me better while they still had the chance.